for me, and I can see that you have started recording. Okay, you will, I'm sure, recognize the picture behind me, and I'm sure that most of you, like myself, have spent the last 3 days in shock and spent the last 3 days gobbling up as much of Rabbi Sacks's inspiration as you possibly can. I'm sure that's something that we've all been doing. Many people far more worthy than I, far more knowledgeable than I, and far more appropriate than I have said many things about Rabbi Sacks. I am not a Hasidic person, but I think I now know what it must feel like to a Chassid when his Rebbe dies, because I have felt bereft the last few days. Even though I didn't know Rabbi Sacks personally that well, although I had the honor of meeting him a few times, I didn't know him well. But nevertheless, I considered him to be somebody who was my moral anchor, as well as that of the world. So, of course, I want to dedicate tonight's learning to his memory, and I want to use up the first 90 seconds of the shiur by just playing you something which I came across, which some of you may have seen already, but it bears seeing again. As you know, this medical ethics course is put on by Tchelet, which is called Inspiring Judaism. That's our strapline, Tchelet, Inspiring Judaism. Exactly 1 year ago, 1 year to the day before Rabbi Sacks passed away, I and Rabbi Ido Pechter, who's one of the other directors of Tchelet, went to see Rabbi Sacks. We were in London for a bat mitzvah, and we went to see Rabbi Sacks. We were granted a 30-minute slot, which turned into a 50-minute slot, I'm happy to say. And we spoke at length with him about our plans for Tchelet. At that time, the Tchelet was just a little idea in our heads, and we wanted to pass it by Rabbi Sacks to hear what he had to say, to see if he would encourage us, see if he would give us some kind of a steer. And of course, as you would imagine, he was very, very encouraging. We came out of there, both of us, elated, having felt that we were in the presence of an Adam Gadol, a great man. We had plans that Rabbi Sacks would do a video for us, specifically for Tchelet. We never got round to that, sadly, and now that won't happen. But the idea of Tchelet being inspiring Judaism really is a result of that meeting with Rabbi Sacks, because he inspired us in that direction. So I found this little 90-second video, which I'm going to share with you now. I make no apologies if you've already seen it, because, well, you'll see. Rav Yaakov Tzvi ben David Aryeh Zecher Tzadik Livracha, Yehi Zichro Baruch. Okay, let's talk about our subject. Let me get up the handouts. Those of you who have yours printed, have it to hand, then please get it. Let me just share the screen again. There you go. Hopefully you can see that. Can you see the screen? Yeah. Okay. Right. Confidentiality. Confidentiality. What do we mean by confidentiality? Well, I think we all probably understand the basis of the term is that we have a responsibility as healthcare providers to keep secrets, to not pass information on about person A to person B. It is a fundamental building block of the relationship between a patient and a healthcare provider, doctor, a nurse, any other healthcare provider, that the information that they pass to that healthcare provider will not go any further outside of that relationship. And the reason that it's so important is that if that's not there, if the patients can't trust the confidentiality of their doctor, of their healthcare provider, then what is known as the fiduciary patient-doctor relationship will break down. This expression fiduciary relationship is something that you will read quite a lot about. You'll see that terminology used a lot if you read around the subject of medical ethics. And what it means is it comes from the Latin word fiducia, which means confidence or trust. And the fiduciary relationship between a patient and his medical carers is that bond of trust that is so important to the diagnostic and therapeutic process. Now, why is it so important? The reason that it's so important is that if patients cannot trust their carers to keep their secrets, then they won't tell them. So just something very straightforward, a simple example. A person who goes to the doctor with with symptoms of a potential sexually transmitted disease. Now, this person may be in a relationship with another person, and they may have strayed outside of that relationship. And it may well be that during that straying, they have picked up this sexually transmitted disease. It's going to be very important for the healthcare giver to know what the patient has been up to in that regard in order to make the diagnosis. Now, if the patient cannot trust that the doctor is going to keep that information confidential, and he's not going to go down a pub and say, you'll never guess who's having an affair with somebody, or he's going to meet his or her spouse in the lift and tell them what's going on. If that can't be trusted, then for sure the patient's not going to give that information to the doctor. And the whole breakdown, there will be a breakdown of that relationship, and the whole therapeutic process, the diagnostic process to start with, will fall apart. So it's necessary for patient-doctor relationships to survive, for the basic confidentiality to be understood by both parties right from the start. And it's an accepted code of professional ethics in all healthcare professions. Some are more careful about it than others. When I say some, I mean some professions. I've had situations where I've had healthcare professionals, particularly people in the mental health caregivers, counselors, psychologists. They're particularly careful about this, and they have written to me about patients using some kind of way of identifying the patient to me, like initials of their name or something like that. And I haven't had a clue who they're talking about, because they've taken the confidentiality aspect of it to such a high degree that they haven't actually given me enough information to try and identify that patient myself. And I've actually had to go and seek that out. Now, that is not a bad thing at all. What they're doing is taking their responsibility of healthcare confidentiality very, very seriously. So it's very important that we have to create and maintain this trusting environment by respecting patient privacy, which will encourage patients to seek the care that they need. So that's the basis of why we have to be confidential. But what does that mean? What does it mean? What is the obligation of confidentiality? Well, quite simply, that prohibits the healthcare provider from disclosing information about the patient or the patient's case to anybody else without permission, unless there is what we call authorized access. Now, this is where the area becomes a little bit gray, because who is authorized and what levels of authorization there may be may differ from case to case. So obviously it's important that different doctors who are involved in the care of a patient will discuss that patient. So if there's a handover of care, if there is, for example, let's say a physician wants to refer a patient to a surgeon for surgery to take place, well, obviously the surgeon needs to know all the medical details of the patient so that the surgeon can be prepared and make the appropriate arrangements and precautions for treating that person. So that's an obvious case where confidentiality is, if you like, breached because of authorized access. Now, there may well be areas that some people need to know some things about the patient, but not everything. And so therefore, it's a decision-making process that has to be done on a case-by-case basis. One of the problems that we have today is that most of healthcare records are electronic. Now, electronic records, or electronic everything, is very easy to pass on, very easy to pass on to the wrong person. I can't tell you how many pocket calls we've had on the Poleg English speakers group, where people press record on their pockets and then pass it on by mistake onto the group. So far, I don't think we've had any serious breaches of confidentiality, but it's very easy to do. I, for one, can tell you, and I'm sure that many of you will fall into this category, I have sent the wrong email to the wrong person on a number of occasions, and quickly had to recall it or delete it. It's very, very easy to do. And for that reason, there are big challenges with electronic records, and there are various acts of law in various different countries which tell you what you can and can't do with your electronic records. So I've listed them here. There's the HIPAA in America. I did actually, yesterday when I put this together, I did actually know what HIPAA stood for, but I've forgotten now. But it's basically confidentiality. GDPR is the equivalent in the UK. I can't remember what that stands for either. And Israel, where is Elaine? Elaine, I've got the Israeli one for you here. It's in the basic law, human dignity and liberty in Israel. Now, of course, Israel, being sensible, doesn't use letters to tell us what it is. It uses proper words so you can see what it is. But either way, all of these three countries and many other Western countries have laws about what you can and cannot store electronically and where you can store them. Now, as many of you will know, I spend some of my time doing medico-legal work, and I am passed every single day, I am passed confidential records via electronic methods. And every single document that comes has to have a password. And that password has to be sent separately, not in the same email. Many firms of solicitors that I deal with actually require me to phone them to get the password. They won't even send the password in a separate email. So everything is password protected, everything is encrypted. No patient details are identified in the headers of emails. So if the email is about, I don't know, who's the first name on my thing? It's about Charles Simonoff, then it will not say Charles Simonoff in the header, it will say CS, so that nobody can identify it. So the electronic records are a particularly challenging area for keeping confidentiality. So I use that as an example because we think of confidentiality issues as a person deliberately speaking about somebody else to a third party. But in today's world of immediate, instant communication, it's very easy electronically to do this in error and to do it without knowing that you are breaking confidentiality. And we'll have a look in our cases in a minute or two, exactly what we come to there. Now, here's a few sort of ideas just to throw about. What if a family member asks how the patient is doing? Okay, so let's say a doctor goes in to see a patient, and on the way out, the patient, having consulted with the patient's son or daughter is just arriving in the house to visit, and sees that the doctor is just coming out and says to the doctor, "Oh, you've been to see my mum. That's really nice. Thank you very much for coming. How is she doing?" Simple question that you would not really give two thoughts about. And the doctor may not give too much thought about it either, and may say, "Oh, she's doing fine," or "she's on the mend," or "there's nothing to worry about," or anything like that. But did the doctor have explicit permission from that patient to discuss the case with their spouse, their child, parent, whatever it is? And usually the answer to that is no, because you don't normally go in and say, "Do you mind if I tell your child, husband, whatever, how you are?" But actually, that's what we should do. Now, it's easier for us to understand that if we're saying sensitive information. So let's say, you've had to, God forbid, give bad news to that patient. Maybe that patient doesn't want anybody to know that bad news. Maybe that patient doesn't want to worry their relative that's come to visit them. Maybe they have fallen out with that relative and don't want to tell them anything, good or bad. You cannot assume that a patient has given you permission, even if you think it's okay. I'm going to give you a little example that happened to me, which at the time, it was many years ago. I don't know, must be 25 years ago or more. And at the time, I thought this was absurd. But now, in the current understanding of GDPR and how careful one must be about confidentiality, I can see that what I thought was absurd was not quite so absurd. The story was like this. A lady gave birth to a baby boy, and I went to see the baby in my capacity as their GP. I went to see the mother and the baby, and I did whatever you do there. Had a look at the baby, had a look at the mother, we had a chat, blah, blah, blah. And as I'm coming down the stairs, one of our mutual friends, in other words, there was a friend of the mother of this child who'd just given birth, and she also happened to be a friend of mine, of my family. She was coming to visit, and I was coming down the stairs, and she said very innocently, "Is everything okay?" And I said, "Yeah, everything's fine. Wow, what a gorgeous baby." And it was. This kid happened to be a particularly attractive baby. You know, if you go and you see an ugly baby, you don't go and say, "Wow, that's the ugliest baby I've ever seen." No, you don't do that. But, you know, I didn't think I'd done anything wrong at all. I'd said, "Yeah, everything is fine." And wow, B'li Ayin Hara, what a gorgeous baby. Anyway, didn't think anything more of it. Off I go. Sometime later, when I saw this mother again, she gave me the biggest Misha Beirach you can imagine. Right? How dare you speak about my baby to somebody else? And I thought at the time that that was ridiculous. All I said was that the baby was gorgeous and that there was no problem. And I thought that was ridiculous. But actually, she was right. Now, when we consider and we stop and we think about the concept of patient confidentiality, I had no right to say anything about that patient, about that baby, because I was there in a professional capacity. Now, you may say, well, you didn't do any harm and you didn't mean any harm, which is all true. But the fact remains that now I understand, which I didn't understand then, I understand that I didn't have explicit permission to say that. And this particular lady was particularly sensitive about Ayin Hara and one thing and another, and did not want me saying those things. And I did not respect her confidentiality on that occasion. Now, I give you that example because I thought that was a bit silly at the time, and now I don't. And I dare say that some of you might listen to that and think that's a bit silly. But nevertheless, it's a fact that I didn't have explicit permission, and therefore I should not have shared any information or given my opinion on anything at all in that situation. Now, there are other kinds of disclosures that happen that also could be inappropriate. For example, I've given an example here, and this quite often happens in hospitals where doctors are going up and down in the lifts and they're discussing various cases. They would not use names, of course, but sometimes they're not all that careful to make sure that the patients that they're discussing can't be identified. And the elevators or the lifts or other public places are not suitable places for discussing medical details and private information. And one has to be very careful about doing that, because it's not maintaining confidence, it's not building trust with the patients. Another example is that, and this should never happen today, teaching. We use, often when people are teaching, they'll use case histories, the case histories that we've used here. And you will see that those of you that have read the case history, the case histories that I've left you, I have actually identified some people in those case histories. And I've done that deliberately because I wanted you to see that, and I wanted you to be up in arms that I shouldn't have done that, because I have identified people. Have I checked with those people that I've identified that they don't mind me identifying them? Well, we'll have to see when we get to it. So any identifiable information must be removed or encrypted so that people can't inadvertently break confidences. So that's the basis. But of course, there are exceptions to the rule of confidentiality, and that's really where we need to concentrate most of our minds tonight, because the concept of keeping a confidence, I think everybody understands, everybody appreciates. It may be that we don't always appreciate the level to which we must go, as per the story I've just told you, but nevertheless, we understand the basic concept of confidentiality. But what about when we should or need to consider breaking a confidence? Okay, let's have a look at some of these. So I've titled this here, when is it appropriate for confidentiality to be breached? And the expression that is used in much of the literature is this one here: overriding concerns. Overriding concerns can lead to the need to breach confidentiality in certain circumstances. Now, this term overriding concerns obviously is open to interpretation, but the very nature of that word overriding means that it overrides the aspect of confidentiality. So in each individual case that we must look at, whenever we're faced with this, then we have to ask ourselves, is there a concern which overrides my fundamental requirement to not breach confidentiality? So let's go through this. Number one, and this is the main thing here: concern for the safety of other specific persons. Now, yes, medical information is legally restricted. We cannot go blabbing about things that we hear from patients in the consultation room. But what happens if what we hear poses a threat to a third party? So somebody comes in and says, I am hearing voices. I am getting messages from God. The message from God tells me that I must go and do something terrible. I must go and kill Fred Bloggs. That's what these voices are telling me. And it's very strong. And I feel the urge to act on these voices. Or somebody comes in and says to you, I hate that person so much that I'm going to kill him. I really am. I'm going to kill him. I'm going to take the gun and I'm going to blow his brains out. And you hear that within the context of your consultation room. Now, on the one hand, you are bound by confidentiality. That patient has told you that information in confidence. Now, of course, this doesn't only apply to doctors, it applies to all professional relationships, but we're, of course, talking about medical ethics, so we're going to apply it in a healthcare setting. So when a patient shares a specific plan to harm a particular individual or group of individuals, somebody may say they're going to go and blow up a restaurant or something, God forbid, then that could be construed to be an overriding concern. Now you'll say, of course, that's an overriding concern. Well, you have to make a judgment call as to whether that threat is credible or not. Because if it's not a credible threat, then you've got to think twice. So the person that says, I hate that person so much, I'm going to kill him, is very different to say, if you say, I hate that person so much that I'm getting, in fact, I've already bought the gun. I've bought the gun, I've got the ammunition, and I'm going tomorrow morning, I'm going to blow his head off. That's very different to somebody saying, you know what, I really dislike that person. I feel like murdering him. There are two very different scenarios there, and somebody has to make a judgment call. I'm going to share with you now a case that will be very familiar to anybody who has ever studied medical ethics in any way at all. It's probably the most famous case in confidentiality ever. It'll be familiar to the Americans with us, even if you haven't studied medical ethics, because it took place in California, and it was a landmark case and was is quoted very often. And it's the Tarasoff case. And I'm going to tell you what happened here. It's written down for you, but I'm going to briefly go through it. There was a student in California University, and he disclosed to one of his counselors that he intended to go and shoot this person called Tatiana Tarasoff. That was the name of the person. The psychologist, who was called Dr. Moore, ironically, you'll remember Dr. Moore's name from week 1 when we spoke about the idea of our British Dr. Moore, who was tried for murder because he gave the patient big doses of morphine. This is not the same Dr. Moore. This is a different Dr. Moore. The Dr. Moore, the psychologist, believed the threat and thought the threat was indeed credible. So Dr. Moore now has a dilemma. On the one hand, Dr. Moore has received confidential information and has to respect that confidentiality. On the other hand, Dr. Moore believes that there is now a credible threat to the safety and even the life of a third party, Tarasoff. So, what were the options that Dr. Moore had? Dr. Moore could have said, I am bound by confidentiality. I cannot break that confidentiality. Or Dr. Moore could have said, I am forced to break that confidentiality. I need to go and warn Tatiana Tarasoff that she is in danger. Or Dr. Moore could have resorted to reporting this to the police and let them deal with it. And the last of those three things is what Dr. Moore did. Dr. Moore reported this episode, broke confidentiality, and broke the confidentiality, sent the information to the police. The police interviewed Podder, the potential threatener, and they made a decision. They made a decision that he was not a danger to Tarasoff. That was their judgment call. They failed to warn the patient that there was a potential threat to her. And later on, Podder did indeed kill Tarasoff. He stalked her and didn't actually shoot her. He stabbed her to death, but nevertheless, he killed her. And then later on, Tatiana's parents sued the police, the campus police, and the university's healthcare service for failing to warn Tatiana. So not only did the police get sued for making a wrong judgment call, but also Dr. Moore's employers, the healthcare service of the university, that's who Dr. Moore was working for, they were also sued on the basis that they should have also warned the patient, not the patient, sorry, they should also have warned the potential victim as well as informing the police. Now, the lower courts kicked the case out and said, no, actually, Moore had an obligation to maintain confidentiality, and Moore did right not to inform Tarasoff. The case was appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court overruled the lower court and ruled that what should have occurred was that confidentiality should have gone out of the window. The victim should have been warned, as well as the police being informed. Now, The implication of this ruling, which was a landmark ruling at the time, I think it was 1976, if I'm not mistaken, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. The implication of this ruling was that it enshrined in American law and really set up in ethical law the idea that the imminent threats to a third party overrides or trumps, pardon the expression for those who find that offensive, trumps a duty to protect patient confidentiality. But the obligation lies on the therapist, on the healthcare provider, to make the appropriate judgment call. And that is the difficulty. When is that judgment call made? How is it made? Who makes it? And how it's made is the basis of the decision that has to be made. So what we see here is that the basic facts of confidentiality are that we go to extremes. We go to extremes such that we even have to phone up third parties to get a password in order to open up a document that has confidential information. We go to extremes not to inadvertently pass on information. How many times have we seen on the news that cabinet ministers have left their laptop on the train or in the back of the car and had the car broken into and their laptop been nicked? We have to take very good care. We'd have to go to great extremes to protect information. But there is an overriding responsibility to protect the health and safety of others, and that overrides the confidentiality aspect of ethics. So then we have a second idea. What that first idea was all about the threat to individuals or groups of individuals. What about if there's a threat to society as a whole? So, for example, communicable diseases, something like TB or AIDS or some other kind of communicable disease, which is a responsibility to prevent passing on that disease, such as COVID-19. What if we have knowledge that a certain person has this disease and is not taking the appropriate precautions not to pass this disease on, or worse than that, is deliberately intending to pass this disease on? There may not be a threat to a specific person. They may not have said, I am going to go out and I am going to cough and splutter over Fred Bloggs, but they may have said, I have a vendetta against the world and I am going to go and cough and splutter on as many people as I can and infect as many people as I can in the world. Now, so the state with a capital S has a responsibility to protect its citizens. And this outweighs individual liberties in certain cases. And this means that we are looking really at a similar idea to the one we touched on last week of the utilitarian argument. The utilitarian argument in ethics is an argument which says that we must do whatever it takes to bring about the most good to the most people, even if that means doing some harm to some few people. So in this particular case, the harm that we may be doing to somebody is breaking their confidentiality. But that is outweighed by the utilitarian aspect, the good, the overall good, which is maintained by stopping this person spreading a communicable disease. So if you wanted to ask yourself, before you were going to breach confidentiality, you wanted to ask yourself a question to help you make that decision. This is a question which I can't say that I made this up. This is a question which is out there in the literature, which I have purloined. But I think I wish I had thought of it, because I think it's very succinct. Ask yourself the following question. Will the lack of this specific patient information that you've just been told, will the lack of this put another person or group that you can identify at high risk of serious harm? Now, you have there two words which are very subjective: high risk and serious harm. One man's meat is another man's poison. What I consider a high risk, somebody else might consider a low risk. What I consider serious harm, somebody else might not consider serious harm. And there will always be a grey area. And it's in those grey areas that people will differ in their opinions. But it doesn't matter. As long as you ask yourself that question and you answer that question honestly and to the best of your ability, then you can be sure that what you're doing will be ethically correct. It may not have the desired effect that you want it to have. In other words, you might make a mistake, but ethically, you will have done nothing wrong. There is a difference between making a mistake in an ethical and understandable way to being negligent by not considering the ethics properly in the first place. That's a very important distinction. Not every mistake is ethically negligent. That's a very important concept that you must always bear in mind. Now, just before we go on to the cases, let's have a look about one particular grey area, and that's adolescence. Okay, in most Western societies, the age of majority is 18. I know that in some states in America, it's 21. And I think there are in some rather liberal states, I could be wrong about this, but I think in some of the I've forgotten the word I'm looking for now. Norway, Sweden, all those kind of places, there's a word that goes for them, I can't think of it. But anyway, those sort of places which tend to be a bit more liberal, their age of majority for various things is lower than 18. But let's work on the basis that most places work on the age of majority being 18. What about adolescence? So you've got somebody age 16, 15, 16, 17, 17 and a half, and they come to you with confidential information. This is a grey area. Do you have permission, without explicit permission, from the patient to divulge that information to their parent or guardian? Or do you have to treat that adolescent as you would any other adult person? And again, it comes down to a judgment call. So, for example, the last sentence I put here is it would be difficult to justify breaking a confidence of a 17-year-old girl who has full capacity and is mature enough to make independent decisions just because she's legally a minor. So in other words, a 17-and-a-half-year-old girl who comes to you and asks for, let's say, contraceptive advice, or asks for advice on termination of pregnancy. She finds herself pregnant and she wants information about termination of pregnancy. Or she reveals to you that she is taking harmful illicit substances and she's a girl of 17 and a half. It would be very difficult, in my view, to justify breaking confidences of that kind of person in that kind of age group. But somebody who comes in who is aged, say, 14 and says to you that they are being harassed or potentially sexually abused by somebody else, then that is a different ball game altogether. So those are just two examples where there may be grey areas because of age. There may be grey areas because of the information that you've been given. Is it harmful? Would it cause serious harm? Is there a high risk? The Tarasov case, they made a judgment call. I was going to say a bad judgment call then, but that would be unfair of me because I didn't know exactly what they were told. They made an incorrect judgment call, as it turns out. The police made an incorrect judgment call. They did not think that there was a high risk of serious harm. Turns out they were wrong. But whether they were negligently wrong is not for us to say with the benefit of hindsight and the benefit of 40 odd years retrospection. So the idea of confidentiality, just to sum up before we look at the cases, the concept of confidentiality is a fundamental, important bedrock of any patient-doctor relationship. When I say doctor, I mean any healthcare provider, because of the potential breakdown of the fiduciary or trusting relationship between physician and patient. On the other hand, this has to be measured against the information that's being given to you being that which could potentially cause serious harm to somebody else or some other group of people. And it is the responsibility of the healthcare giver not to break a confidence ever, unless that you have considered the possibilities of overriding concern, and unless you can justify breaking that confidence by overriding concern, then you cannot break that confidence. So with that in mind, I want now just to before I split you into groups for a few minutes, I just want to whiz through with you the cases that I gave you. I gave you a few different cases today, more than one, and you can look at them in whatever way you want. But I just want to go through with them. Those of you who've got it printed out in front of you, get them out. Otherwise, I'm hoping you can see that on the screen. Can you see case one on the screen? Yeah, okay. So case one is quite simple, okay? This has happened to me. It wasn't my grandfather, because my grandfathers both passed away before I was born, but it was a very close relative. I was working in a hospital, as was Adam. Let's do Adam rather than my case, because I'm coming in case two. Adam works on the cardiology unit at the hospital and learns that his grandfather was admitted to hospital overnight. He's not been able to get in touch with his grandfather. So whilst he's working on the computer getting results for his own patient, he has a little look at his grandfather's health record to find out what room he is in and why he's been admitted. And the question for you to discuss is it acceptable for Adam to access his grandfather's health record? And if not, why not? And if so, is it acceptable for him to check his grandfather's health record just to see what room he's in so he can go and see him? Or is he allowed to look a bit further than that? So the question I'm asking you, if you're going to look at that case, is how much information, if any at all, is Adam allowed to glean from looking at his grandfather's health record whilst he's on the computer for his own patient? Now, how about case number two? Here is a case, a real live case. Okay, a real life case which is breaking confidentiality. Okay, there are two people who are identified in this case. One of them may not have given permission. We'll have to see. The case is this. Dr. Lieberman's daughter, Rena, had an inspirational art teacher when she was at school in Manchester. Rena now lives in Israel and has lost touch with her old teacher. She wants to send her a gift of her latest piece of artwork, as a thank you for all the encouragement that she gave her when she was a school child. This teacher is, or at least was, a patient at Dr. Lieberman's practice. Dr. Lieberman offers to find the teacher's address and phone number from the practice database and give it to Rena to allow her to get in touch. Is this allowed? After all, there is no medical information being passed on, only an address and a phone number. So is it allowed? If not, why not? And if it's not allowed, and you justify not allowing that, what would an alternative solution be to this problem, which would not breach confidentiality? So that's case number 2 for you to have a look at. Number 3. Now, this is something which has also happened to me. Not exactly like this, with this particular condition, but similar conditions. You are the doctor of a young man who is HIV positive. You read on simchas.com that this young man has just got engaged to be married to the daughter of a friend of yours. You are pretty sure that this girl and her family are not aware that the boy has HIV. What do you do, and how do you do it? Okay, now these are all cases which will come up on a regular basis. Now, case number 5, you'll realize there is no case number 4. There was a case number 4, but I didn't like it in the end and I took it out, and I forgot to change number 5 to number 4. So there is no case number 4, but case number 5 is another common scenario, sadly. Mr. Jameson is a former patient of yours who's recently deceased. Several days after his death, his son, who you've met on several occasions before and who had a good relationship with his father, as far as you know anyway, comes to the unit to thank you for taking such good care of his father under your care. The son does not have a good relationship with his sister, who happens to be the father's power of attorney. The son has not received any details of his father's death, how he died, and he requests this information from you. So the question is this. First of all, what are the issues? Secondly, if this son does not have power of attorney, are you allowed to provide information on his father's death? And if so, what are you allowed to provide? And is consent required to release personal health information after death? And if so, when? And those are the 4 cases that I get. Right, so I'm going to split you up into groups now for a few minutes, and then we will go through some halachic aspects. Before I split you up, is there anybody with a burning question that can't wait till the end? If there is, put up your icon that says hand up, or alternatively, unmute yourself and shout out. You have a few seconds to do so before I split you up into groups.
Yeah, can I ask you a question?
Yes, Lynn.
I noticed you didn't mention child abuse tonight. Was there a reason? Because it just seems that that's such an important part of confidentiality.
Okay, we can discuss child abuse. I decided to use murder instead of child abuse, but I guess they're both in the same category. I didn't deliberately omit child abuse, no. I'd be happy for you to give your views on child abuse and breaking confidentiality afterwards in our discussion. Anybody else before we split up? Okay, here we go. Breakout rooms. Assign automatically. We have 45, so we'll make 10 rooms. Okay, here we go. Anybody that doesn't want to be in a room I think there is a facility for removing yourself. One or two people have said to me that they don't like this thing. They feel a bit embarrassed to speak. I don't want to embarrass anybody. I don't want to put anybody to be put into a situation where they feel uncomfortable. So anybody that doesn't want to be in a room, I think there is a facility to remove yourself from it. Please feel free to do so. I'm going to give you 10 or 12, 15 max minutes to discuss one or more than one case, to see if you can share some ideas and find some areas of disagreement, because that's how you learn. It's no good if you all agree with one another. So here we go.
Room 4.
Are we pressing join?
Oh yeah, join.
Do we press on the join?
Yeah, you have to press on join. Yes, press on join.
Room we're supposed to be in.
We're not in anybody's room. What's going on? Hello, we're supposed to be in room 10 and it's not
Jonathan,
gone.
I think you need to unmute.
Yeah, we are on mute. We are on mute.
We are
Right.
unmuted.
I have just assigned you Rachel Marks. You should get a join now. Robert, you should also get a join now to room 1.
Oh, okay.
Right, George.
You've got a join, Robert, to room 1.
I can't see join. I can see, let's have a look here. How do I do it? Stop, mute my video pin. Share screen. I can't see actually join.
Oh dear.
Shall I leave altogether and come back in?
No, let me try and move you again then. I'll move you to 2 and see if that helps.
Two Jonathan Liebermans there.
Have you got a join there now?
I haven't got anything inviting me, although I'm on a panel of 5.
Right. Can you see anyone? Can they hear you? Or only me can hear you?
Yeah, I can just see Naomi West.
Bye, chicken guy.
It's fine. I can sit this one out. It's not good. I was in a room on my own, but he's trying to put me in another room. No, you can't do that. You need to unmute, Jonathan.
Robert,
Hi.
I'm going to try and put you back into 10.
Okay, it's fine. I can sit this out. It's not a problem.
Well, anyway, you can tell me what you think, Robert. We'll have a room on our own.
I'm quite happy to sit this out. Actually, go and have a cup of tea.
You go and have a cup of tea. Good idea.
All
Good
right
idea.
then. I'll see you soon.
Yeah.
Okay.
Rena, can you see me?
Yeah.
Can't see you. Do you want to go in a room or you don't want to go in a room?
No, I'm painting.
All right. Did you see the cases?
Yeah.
Did I break confidentiality?
No, I mean, yeah, because, well, you kind of did, because you told me you were going to, you didn't say what it
But I
was.
didn't ask your permission, did I?
No, you did break confidentiality.
Correct, I did.
But did you break you got her address before?
Yeah, but that's how I got it. I shouldn't have done it.
I'm saying, is it wrong?
Yeah, yeah. Theoretically, it's wrong, but I think most people would say, well, actually, yeah, technically it's wrong, but I think most people would say, well, it's not the worst crime you've ever done.
Yeah, but if she sued you, you'd be in trouble.
Yeah, if she did not want you to know where she lived, yeah.
Yeah.
Right, I'm going to join another room and see what's going on.
Okay, try.
Okay, looks like we are nearly all back. Yes, we're all back now. Okay, so I'm just muting you all again. Very good. Right, so we're all back from our rooms. I hope you found the discussion interesting. I am going to now go through with you the Jewish approach to this, and then those of you that want to stay behind and have a chat and discuss it further, then we can do that. Can you see my screen with the yeah, good. Okay, so here we go. The halachic approach to confidentiality. Now, those of you who have been involved in the past with various rabbis may be forgiven for thinking that this is an area of halakha which many of them have failed to study. My experience, I can see Rochelle hiding a little smile behind her hand there. My experience, and I think that some people would recognize this, is that many people in the halachic world are not very good at this, are not very good at keeping confidences, and that's a big problem which I think needs addressing. So here is the halakha. It's based on a pasuk in the Torah, in Parashat Kedoshim. If you want to look it up, it is in Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 16. Lo telech rachil ba'amecha, lo ta'amod al dam reyecha, ani Adonai. Do not go around being a gossiper. Rachil is a gossiper. Be'amecha, amongst your people. Do not stand idly by on the blood of your fellow. I am Hashem. So you've got three bits, if you like, of this verse. If you split it up into three, don't go around gossiping. Don't stand idly by on the blood of your brother, of your fellow, and I am God. Three separate issues there. Now, by the way, just as an interesting bit, this word rachil, do not go around being a rachil. A rachil was a peddler. You know, the peddler, you know, they used to go around selling little bits and bobs of needles and threads and matches and all that stuff. A peddler was somebody that went around from place to place. And in fact, even in English, we use that expression, don't we, to peddle gossip. Yeah, I'm sure some of you have heard that expression. Howard's giving me a nod there. I thought Howard would know that. So it comes from the same word. It also, interestingly, Rav Steinsaltz points out in his commentary to this pasuk that it is connected in some way with the chaf becoming a gimel, and it being Resh Gimel Lamed, Regel, which is the word for foot. And of course, we know that word, that root of that word, Resh Gimel Lamed, in a very negative way when it comes to speech. And we know that from the Torah in Sefer Bamidbar. And of course, I'm referring to the episode of the Meraglim, the spies. Meraglim, the root of that is Resh Gimel Lamed, from Regel, which means foot, which means to walk and everything. So the idea of a meragel, a spy, is that they go around from place to place and they say things, they find out secrets. That's what a spy does, isn't it? A spy finds out secrets of the enemy and brings it back. So that's just an interesting aside on this word rachil. So the halacha is based on this. Do not go around being a gossiper amongst your people. Now the Rambam dissects this part of the pasuk very clearly, and he says, who is considered a gossip monger? There's our expression, peddles. One who peddles information from one to another, saying This is what so-and-so said. This is what I heard about so-and-so. If you want to look it up, it's in Rambam Mishnah Torah, Hilchot Dayot, chapter 7, Mishnah 2. Now, even if that gossip is not derogatory, even if it is not derogatory, then you cannot say it. And therefore, I was guilty, according to the Rambam, of doing that when I said to this girl, wow, what a beautiful baby, because it was not derogatory, but it was not my business to do so. So, albeit on a fairly non-harmful way, I fell foul of that on that occasion. Now, if it's derogatory, then it's known as lashon hara, which means evil speech. If that derogatory gossip is actually untrue, then it's not lashon hara. Then it's known as motzi shem ra, which means to bring out a bad name. You're giving somebody a bad name because it's not even true. Lashon hara is derogatory gossip, which is true. Rechilut is non-derogatory gossip, which may or may not be true. So the Rambam is very clear about these things. Rambam is very strict on confidentiality. We're not even talking about medical things here. We're talking about just on a one-to-one basis. So as a halachic default, when somebody confides in his friend, the friend is duty bound to maintain that information in confidence and not to gossip about it to other people. That is the default position al pi halacha. A very important default position. Do not pass on information to anybody about anything unless you have permission to do so. Unless, now the halacha is in tandem, it's in parallel here with the Western ethical morals that we spoke about earlier on. There is overriding necessity to save others. So you can override confidentiality to save others. Now, as we've seen from the Tarasov case, there are times when withholding information can have devastating effects on others. And therefore, confidence should, in fact, be broken. So we have to look at the halachic rules for breaking confidence. Now, what's interesting is that, let's just go back to the whole pasuk here in red. We said there were three parts to this pasuk. Lo telech rachil b'amecha, don't go gossiping. Lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, do not stand by idly on your brother's blood. In other words, don't allow somebody to be harmed when you could do something about it. Don't stand idly by on the blood of your brother means if you have an opportunity to save somebody from harm, then you have an obligation to do it. Now, what are those two things got to do with one another? One of the opinions, according to the Kli Yakar and the Orach Chaim, for example, the second part of the pasuk actually qualifies the first part. So the first part says, don't pass on any information to anybody else. The second part says, don't do anybody any damage. In other words, don't pass on any information as long as not passing on that information will not cause harm to somebody else. So that, in other words, when is it that you are prohibited from gossiping and you are obliged to maintain a confidence? Only when maintaining that confidence will not result in your fellow's blood being spilled. And that doesn't necessarily mean only about death. It means harm in any kind of way, even financial harm. So in other words, you cannot stand idly by. You must break that confidence in order to save somebody else. So the application of the second half of the pasuk is actually brought by the Rambam himself, and that in a different place in the Hilchot Rotzeach. Rotzeach means a murderer. In the laws of murder, you are in there. He brought out that you must inform a person if you know of a plot to harm somebody. You have an obligation, according to halacha, to split the confidence. And again, my Rambam says in elsewhere that it does not only apply to physical harm, but also damage in other ways: psychological damage, financial harm, reputational damage, any kind of significant damage. Then you, if you know of a plot to cause that, then you have an obligation al pi halacha to speak about that. Now, let's have a look at go in a bit more detail of this. Well, yes, Howard. You're muted. Howard, you're muted.
Sorry, this is not standing idly by. I haven't got the precise wording here. By thy neighbour's blood has been extended in Israel to cover situations not covered under English law, but covered under European law, whereby if you're not in a special relationship with somebody who you see dying, in Israel you have an obligation to assist them. In the UK you don't.
Okay.
Under English law you don't. And it's taken from the Tanakh and enacted under Israeli law in 1998. It's quite interesting.
That's very interesting. I didn't know that.
Much more extensive than just Lashon Hara.
Okay, so lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, that's where it will come from. It's on the screen now in red. Do not stand idly by. Thank you for that, Howard. Very interesting. Just as an aside on that, there is in UK law, you are not obliged by law to treat a patient that you find on the floor. However, the GMC will take a very dim view of you stepping over this person and walking away. It's not a legal obligation, as you say, but the Good Samaritan, as it's called, the GMC, the General Medical Council, would take a very dim view of not getting involved in that. That would go against, of course, our Hippocratic oath. It would also go against our first principle of medical ethics that we spoke about a few weeks ago, of beneficence, of always trying to do benefit for somebody.
Can I just correct myself? There's no such thing as UK law. I meant the laws of England and Wales.
Thank you very much.
No idea what Scottish law says.
Okay, yes, we don't want to upset our Scots, that's for sure. Right, thank you for that. That was really interesting. Let's just carry on where I was up to.
Hang on, Johnny,
where was that? Yes.
Isn't that in England? Because if the doctor isn't insured, he can't just treat that person.
Okay, so that's an interesting point that Hilary raises. It's perhaps more pertinent in the States, although in the UK now it's also beginning to be in the same way. And that is, there are numerous cases where doctors have got involved as Good Samaritans, where they've seen emergency situations and have later been sued by the patient, either for doing a poor job or for doing a job at all, or one thing and another. So yeah, it's certainly something which needs to be borne in mind. It's interesting. I didn't know that about Israeli law, so I'm very interested that Howard raised that. I shall go and look it up afterwards for my own education. Let's carry on. I'd like to just get through the end of the halachic stuff, and then we can chat after that. So, what are the specifics of this overriding of confidentiality? Again, it's a judgment call. What if you only suspect that there's a threat, but you're not sure? So again, you've got to make a judgment call. Then you've got another answer, another question. What if you're disclosing this information is not going to avert a danger anyway? So, for example, something that occurred to me this morning while I was thinking about this after I'd put all this together, and I didn't have time today to go and add it in. But I was thinking about this. Those of you who are familiar with the UK scene will be aware of a case over the last few years of Jimmy Savile. Jimmy Savile, for those of you that don't know, was a celebrity in the UK who was a bit of a national treasure and won all sorts of awards, including a knighthood for doing all sorts of wonderful things. Turns out that he was a serial sexual predator, abuser of children. This was all found out after his death, although some people knew about it before and didn't speak about it, which is our issue here. What would be a scenario, I wondered to myself this morning, if I now have a piece of information about somebody who's already died and they have abused somebody, they've done a particularly criminal act. There's no danger of this person doing it again to somebody else because he's dead. Would there be a position for me to disclose that piece of information, for example, to the Jimmy Savile inquiry, to the police who are looking into the historical sexual abuse surrounding this case? Would I be correct to break the confidence of somebody on the basis that this is a piece of information that has come to my knowledge? I'm tempted. I'd be interested to know what you guys think when we've finished this, because I'm tempted to say no, because the fellow's dead. He can't do any further damage, and I think it's this sentence here. My disclosing this information is not going to avert any further danger because he is already 6 foot under. So that was just something that occurred to me. I'd like your views later on when we've got through to the end of this. Thirdly, what about if you swear an oath to maintain somebody's confidence? Somebody says to you, if I tell you something, will you absolutely promise me you won't tell anyone? And you absolutely promise, you swear an oath that you will not tell somebody. And then you find out information that you think that you need to tell somebody. What's that situation? Does your swearing an oath change your obligation, or does it not override the danger to somebody else? So let's have a look at what this gentleman, who you will know probably better by his other name, Rabbi Yisrael Meir HaKagan, Rabbi Yisrael Meir Kagan HaKohen, was a great Jewish sage in pre-war Europe, and he wrote extensively on the importance of not engaging in gossip and Lashon Hara. And he is known as the Chafetz Chaim, the Chafetz Chaim, and I'm sure many of you have heard of the Chafetz Chaim. And he's known as the Chafetz Chaim because of a pasuk in Tehillim chapter 34, which says, can you see the Tehillim on my screen now? Yeah, okay, so it says here, Mi ha'ish hechafetz chaim, who is the man who desires life, ohev yamim lirot tov, who loves days and wants to see good. Netzor lashoncha meira, guard your tongue from evil, usfatecha midaber mirma, and your lips from speaking deceitfully. That is why Rabbi Yisrael Meir Kagan was known as the Chafetz Chaim, because it comes from these psukim. His thing was not speaking Lashon Hara. He's written many books about it. Not speaking Lashon Hara, not speaking badly about people, not breaking confidences. And he took his name, as it were, or he was given his name, the Chafetz Chaim, from these psukim. Mi'aisha Chafetz Chaim, Ohev Yamim Lirot Tov. You should recognize this, by the way, because you say it every Shabbat morning in davening. Okay, let's go back to our notes. So the Chafetz Chaim wrote about this, and he addresses this issue of overriding confidentiality And he says that there are several critical conditions that must be met before you break a confidence. And these are they. Number one, you must be pretty sure that this information is going to result in harm to the other person. You don't have to be 100% sure, because you could never be 100% sure, but you have to be pretty sure. Balance of probabilities, reasonable doubt. I don't know the exact percentage you need to be, but you need to know yourself that there is a significant danger here. Secondly, says the Chofetz Chaim, when you're telling the second person of this information, one must tell the facts exactly as they are and do not fall into the trap of embellishment. And that is very difficult. It sounds obvious, but it's very difficult, because when we are doing something, just think about this for 1 second in a dispassionate way. When we are doing something which we're uncomfortable with doing, we tend to try and justify it. And we're uncomfortable with breaking confidences. So there is a great temptation, and the Chofetz Chaim understood this. The Chofetz Chaim understood human psychology so well. There's a great temptation to justify it to yourself and to the other person by laying it on thick. And that must be avoided, says the Chofetz Chaim. If you've got to do it, but do it as it is and do not embellish it. It sounds obvious, but think about the psychology of it. I can certainly tell you there have been times in my life when I've done things which I've been uncomfortable with, and I've tried to justify them to myself by really going to town and telling whatever it is in a juicy sort of way. And that's the Chofetz Chaim is advising and warning against that. And then the third thing is this has to be the last resort. One can only reveal this information if there's no other possible way to prevent this harm to the second person. Now, so what the Chofetz Chaim is saying is, before you do this, stop and think about it. What is your motivation? Remember, right at the beginning of this course, we spoke about Dr. Moore, the British Dr. Moore from Newcastle, not the Dr. Moore from the Tarasov case, but Dr. Moore from Newcastle, who gave the lethal dose of morphine. We spoke about what was his motivation. His original comments to the journalist were that his motivation was to end people's lives in a easy way. When he was on trial, he said his motivation was to reduce pain. And that made all the difference, because we were speaking about kavanah, we were speaking about intention. The Chofetz Chaim here is speaking about the same thing. He says, look deep within yourself and try and ascertain what it is that is your motivation here. Are you sure that you are driven only by your concern for the third party, the other person, and not for some desire for vengeance or just a desire to speak salacious gossip? It seems to be a particular pleasure that some people get from speaking gossip, particularly if it's juicy, salacious gossip. And the fourth thing that the Chofetz Chaim says, you can only reveal this information if you think there's a decent chance that the second person is going to do something about it. If he's not going to do anything about it, if there's no chance or little chance that he's going to do something about it, then you have to think very, very carefully about whether you should speak to the other person. So, to summarize, if you are told information that you are relatively sure will cause harm, and there's no other way to avert it, and you can be fairly sure that the person's going to take notice, then you may tell over that information, but without embellishment. That sentence there summarizes the Chafetz Chaim's view. Now, what about when you swear to not to do so? Okay, so the answer is it doesn't cut. Why? Because you took a different oath. You took an oath. You didn't know it, maybe. You might have forgotten about it, but we were all stood at Har Sinai and we all took an oath in Har Sinai, Na'aseh v'nishma. We will keep the laws of the Torah. We've already taken an oath, and this new oath actually conflicts with that first one that we took. So even if you swore an oath that you would not reveal this confidential information, if you think that there is going to be a danger to somebody else, and you think that that somebody else will take notice and you could avert the danger, and there's no other way to do it, then you are not allowed to stand idly by the second half of our pasuk. Lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, do not stand by on your brother's blood. That takes precedent. So you're already duty bound by an oath not to stand idly by, and so the oath that you take now has no effect whatsoever. So now we've got the general framework according to the Chafetz Chaim. Then we can discuss the more details. We haven't really got any time for this. The rest of this I'll let you read on your own. You've got this in your handouts. There was a case of HIV that I've mentioned in here. I've mentioned here dating in marriage, the shidduchim situation. You can read about that, and the conclusion there is there for everyone to see. So I'm going to shut up now and open up the floor to everybody else. I'll ask, first of all, if you want to speak, please either preferably raise the icon by pressing on the button. If you don't know how to do that, then wave frantically in front of the camera. And if you don't know how to do that and we ignore you, then interrupt at an appropriate time. So comments, questions, insights, the floor is yours.
We're all frightened to say Lashon Hara.
Very good. Glad to hear it, Hilary.
I've got a question, Rav John.
Okay, Viv, go ahead.
When we're talking about spilling blood, you said there's also a prohibition, I think you said, for allowing someone to have financial consequences. Am I right there?
Yes, yes. Lo ta'amod al dam re'echa does not only apply to physical harm.
Right. So if you were in a situation where you were given confidential information and you were aware of the fact that the information you'd been given, if shared with another party, could save everybody involved financial heartache, would you be allowed to share that information?
Okay, so for example, you know information. Let's assume that you know this information to be true. Okay, yeah. We have to work on that basis. You can't work on the basis that something might be true or might not be true. On the basis that you know a piece of information. For example, there would be a person who is offering an investment scheme, okay? And he's offering it around to the community that you live in, let's say. And you know that that investment scheme is either crooked, illegal, or is in some way wrong, and is going to end up with people losing their money. And you know that information to a high degree of certainty. Then not only would you be allowed to tell that information to anybody who is thinking of investing, you would have an obligation, according to most of the poskim, you would have an obligation because if you didn't, you would be over an isur dioraita of lo ta'amod al dam riecha. So the answer to your question is unequivocally yes, you would do so, as long as the criteria were met, i.e. that you knew this to be true, or you knew to the absolute high level that it was true. You also knew that people investing in this were certainly going to lose their money, and that there was no other way of averting that that disaster. Yes, you would be obliged to give over that information. Any other questions? Jonathan and Hilary.
Let Hilary go first. Holy Hilary go first, and I'll.
Johnny,
can you just put down the shared screen and then we can all see one another?
Yeah. There we go.
Okay. Can I just ask you, the power of attorney, if a person has died and the question came up about the brother and sister, once the patient has died, are you still obligated to keep their the circumstances of their death private? Does it have to be through the sister whose power of attorney, and assuming that her power of attorney covers the health side and not just the financial side?
Okay, it's a good question, Hilary. It's a good question. Let me answer it by giving you a potential scenario. The scenario is this: the person concerned who passed away from a disease which was a sexually transmitted disease. Let's say they passed away from syphilis, okay, which is a sexually transmitted disease. And the son, who wants to know the information, has no idea, nor does, let's say, the wife, that this was the case. What benefit is there to passing on that information to other members of the family? There is potential harm, because that could mean that there would be a breakdown in relationships, because you could say the brother could then go to the sister and say, you knew that this was going on, why didn't you tell our mother, etc. The potential for harm is there. So the answer, the basic answer to your question about information about deceased people is that confidentiality is not broken. The chain of confidentiality, the responsibility of confidentiality is not broken by the death of the patient.
Even if it's a genetic illness that he died?
No, okay. So the basis is you still have an obligation of confidentiality to a dead patient. But the same criteria apply as with a live patient. So let's say you have information about a dead patient. Let's say you know that they have a genetic fault. Let's say you know that a person died and they had the BRCA gene, right? This horrible gene which passes on a high risk to the potentially to the members of their family. Let's say you knew that, right? And you have an obligation. Do you have an obligation then to pass that information on? Ideally, that information should be passed on by the person who knows it, i.e. the person who had it. So in life, what you would want to do is you would want to try and persuade the person who has that information to pass it on to those who may be effective. You can't do that once they're dead, right?
But they might not know that if they've been tested. My father was tested and the test didn't come back until after he was dead.
Okay, so if he's dead, he can't do it. That's what I'm saying. If in life, the idea would be, the ideal would be to get the person who has the gene to give that information on to those who may be at risk from it. The question arises, if they refuse to do so, how do you act? How do you act then? And then you have to look, are our criteria of overriding concern for harm to others, is that satisfied by the information that we have? And that would have to be judged on an individual case. And it's the same for a dead person. The only problem is with a dead person, you don't have the option of going to them and trying to persuade them to do the to pass on the information. And by the way, that the same concept applies to the HIV case that we spoke about. Many of you whose room I went into latched onto that straight away, which is that the ideal would be to get the young man in and say to him, look, you have to tell you have to tell the chosen, you have to tell the kala or the kala's family, whoever you decide to do it, and so therefore that would be the ideal. Remember, our Chofetz Chaim's idea is that you're only allowed to pass on that information if there's no other way of doing it. And the correct way of doing it, and this would be the ethical way of doing it as well, would be to try and persuade the person himself to do it. So I think that answers that. Any other questions?
How does the appeal process work? Suppose you don't have the ability and you don't have an alternative. Is there some way that you can take this matter to a third party and have them tell you if that's okay to disclose it?
Yes, indeed, Nachum, that's a very important point. Many healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, etc., would actually use the courts in order to protect themselves in that situation, because the last thing that you want as a healthcare giver is to find yourself on the wrong end of a lawsuit, or even if it's not a lawsuit, the wrong end of a complaint, the wrong end of being upset, somebody being upset with you. So what you would often do is to go to a judge, a legal person. Now, one of the people in one of the groups said, well, you know, you go to a senior rabbi, a rabbi who's an expert in this. And that would be an option in certain communities. In certain communities, the rabbi takes the role of the judge, if you like, and will make the decision as to whether that should be that confidence should be broken. So yeah, there's an option to go to a rabbi if that's something which the particular circumstances dictate, being in that particular community, or to go to a judge to get a legal ruling on it. Yes, absolutely, that would be a very sensible thing to do to protect the healthcare worker really from potential harm to themselves.
Johnny, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Last week you touched on people coming to you where there was a shidduch involved to ask about one, you know, al khatan or the kala, and I just thought it was very, very relevant actually to this week's lecture. But what I wanted to ask you was, what happens if the halakha is in conflict with your duties as a family doctor?
Okay, I don't think that occurs in terms of confidentiality, actually, because I think that the halakha and the obligations in Western medical ethics of confidentiality are very parallel. However, let me answer the question in a different example, which we will probably come to in another week. And that's, let's say, when you have a situation of abortion, somebody who maybe, if you're a practitioner, or maybe you're referring for abortion, or you're going to do an abortion, that it may be a scenario where abortion in a certain situation would be legal according to the law of the land where you're living, but halakha would not allow it. So you have a conflict there. And that situation leads to great difficulties in some cases. I think in most Western societies, there is the facility for a person to invoke their religious beliefs and to excuse themselves from certain things. For example, I'll give you an example which Rochelle will remember very well. Our ex-senior partner in the practice where I worked was a very devout Catholic lady, and she had very strong views about contraception, and she would not prescribe contraception under any circumstances whatsoever. And she invoked her religious beliefs, and she would refer the patient on to somebody else for a different view to her own. But she was able to invoke her own religious beliefs and say that it goes against my religious beliefs. I will not prescribe contraception under any circumstances whatsoever. And that was her prerogative to do so. But she did have an obligation, and she recognized that obligation and fulfilled that obligation to actually enable the patient to have appropriate advice from another practitioner. The question would arise, a difficult question would arise if she was the only doctor in the world, right? Or the only doctor in the area, the only doctor that was available to this particular person. That would be a very difficult question to arise, to discuss, and perhaps maybe on week 8 we will have a week of imponderable questions and discuss that in some detail. Okay, any other questions before we go put the kettle on? Any more for any more? Okay.
Thank you, Johnny.
Thank you very much.
Yes,
Thank
Rochelle.
you. Just the HIV patient, just coming down to Tachlis. If the man you went to him and you tried to persuade him and he still said no and he hadn't told the girl, and what is the what I mean as a healthcare professional, rather than just a shadchan or whatever it is, or someone who's just asking information, what would you do?
Okay, so the situation here is that you have a potential harm to somebody else, and if you had failed after all your attempts to get the person to spill the beans, then you would have an obligation to pass on that information to. And the question is, who would you pass it on to? And assuming that the fiance has capacity, one assumes that, else she shouldn't be getting married, really. But let's assume that she has capacity. Then she is the person that you would have to speak to. You would not be allowed, in my view, to go behind her back and speak to her parents.
Or the shadchan.
Or the shadchan, yes, definitely not the shadchan. Definitely not the shadchan. So in my solution to that terrible conundrum would be reluctantly, but definitely, to speak to the girl herself. Now, it may well be that I would ask the girl, I would say to the girl, I have something very important to talk to you about, and it involves your potential husband. And then I would give her the option, if she wanted to involve her parents, that would be her choice. If she wanted to say, well, I want my parents to come in on this as well. But I would, the initial telling, the only person that you would be allowed to tell would be the girl herself, unless you had her permission to tell anybody else.
Suppose it's not a potential husband, but it actually is the husband. Do you have an obligation to contact the wife and tell her your husband has HIV or your husband has some other sexual transmitted disease, and you better be careful about your relationships.
I think that's a very good question, Nachum, and I think that depends on how the consultation has gone with the husband itself, because again, the ideal, you would want the husband to take that responsibility himself, i.e. to take the appropriate precautions to inform those people that he was putting at risk of the risk. If that person was not going to do that, then I think the same thing applies. I think that you have a responsibility because you are in possession of information which could bring serious, which has a high chance of bringing serious harm to a third party. So I think that if you look at our criteria that we have to go, if we ask our question, let's get back our question on there. There we are. Oh, I've got it. You haven't got it because I'm not sharing you anymore. But it says, will the lack of this specific patient information put another person or group of people you can identify at high risk of serious harm? And if the answer to that is yes, then you have to tell. And I think that question, in the presence of a failure to get the person themselves to act in a responsible manner, I think those criteria are met. And I think the responsibility is to inform the potential person who's going to be potentially harmed.
Okay, thank you.
Johnny, this is all based on halakha, is it? Because it doesn't sound to me like part of the English scene at all. I mean, for example, where you know that the boy has got HIV and you're friendly with the father of the fiancé, the answer is to speak to the boy and say to him, you have to disclose this within a week. You have to come back to me and confirm you've disclosed it. If I don't hear from you, I'll be at liberty to go and talk to my friend, your future father-in-law. And then you put intolerable pressure on him.
I don't think that's right, Howard.
I just don't think you can talk to a younger girl from whose mental state, an emotional state you know nothing about. I mean, the thing is a minefield, but you're going to go in with very heavy boots. No. Indeed, if you start talking to the girl. Now, Nachum's problem is a real conundrum. And I would have thought that if you're going to start telling every spouse about the condition of their spouse, you could spend half your practice life disclosing secrets.
But surely, Howard, if it's HIV, then you must have an obligation, because if the wife ends up with HIV being positive, the children can get from the saliva or the blood. Surely you've got a round robin of consequences.
Well, there must be GMC rules about this, I would have thought, Johnny. No?
Okay, let me just take Laura's been very patiently waving her hand, and then I want to go to Charlie. So Laura first, please.
I will tell you that all physicians, at least in the US, are required by law to report communicable diseases to the state health department, or at least their area health department. It's a requirement. There's no getting around it.
There's a difference in what's...
The mothers are checked routinely for HIV. So the unborn child, they try to prevent harm to that second or third party.
Okay, let me just go to Charlie and Viv, and then I will come back and say what I think to Howard. Charlie and Viv.
There's two things. I checked out. In Britain, HIV is not a notifiable condition. So you're not under any obligation to notify. The other thing is there's many HIV patients now who are on regular therapy who are now thought to be at absolutely no risk to their partner or their children. So if this guy says to you, look, you're my doctor, you know I'm on treatment, you know that my risk is as low as the next person, I'm not sure you've got any right to tell his fiancée.
You're absolutely right, Charlie, because what you've said there is you have asked yourself the question. will the lack of this specific patient information put another person who you can identify at high risk of serious harm? And what you've said there is that in that particular scenario, this person is not at high risk of serious harm. So you've answered the question. So what you've done there is you've actually gone through the process without actually knowing you've gone through the process. You've processed the information and you have made a clinical decision that the fiance is at no risk whatsoever or at low risk of harm, and therefore the criteria are not met, and it makes no difference whether he's got HIV or not, because there's no serious harm. And in that scenario, you may be right. So it's a risk-benefit ratio, and that's the question that you have to ask yourself. Before I go back to Howard, I can see that Joseph is frantically waving there, so I don't want to have harm to himself. So unmute yourself and speak. No, we can't hear.
Okay,
right.
Yeah, no, I am from the Canadian point of view. The Canadian point of view seems to be similar to the American point of view. The doctor has an obligation to report this, and it's not really a question in terms of whether the patient thinks that they are at a low risk or not. That, so to speak, that would be for the other person, the potential fiance or whatever, to decide whether they accept that information or not. But in terms of it being reported, person has a communicable disease and it has to be reported. The doctor has an obligation to report.
Is HIV a notifiable disease in Canada?
Absolutely. There's recently a major court case in which a person got into a lot of trouble because he was playing around with different women without telling them.
Right. Okay. So that's interesting. So there you have a difference there between Canada and the UK, where it's apparently not a notifiable disease. In the USA, I think it is. I think we heard. So that makes that obviously takes the choice away from you. If it's a legal obligation, then it's a legal obligation. But on the basis of the halakha, and the basis of, let's pretend for a moment that the person's in the UK and is not a notifiable disease, what Charlie has said, I think is sensible, because if the doctor, not necessarily the patient, but if the doctor makes a decision, a clinical decision, that the risk to the patient is not a high risk of serious harm, then confidentiality is not allowed to be breached. Because confidentiality is, as we said right at the beginning, one of the major pillars of the relationship between the patient and the doctor. So that's really interesting that we have a difference between the Canadian and the American law on the one hand. I wonder what the law is in Israel. Does anybody know whether HIV is a notifiable disease in Israel? Okay, that's another piece of homework I suppose I'll have to do. Okay, I shall report back next week.
Let us know next week.
Yeah, I'll let you know next week.
We have taken HIV and looked at it as a disease, but we haven't looked at it as a wife would look at it, who finds out her husband is a homosexual, unless he got this from a blood transfusion, that she is in the relationship with a man who is not somebody that she would like to ever be with. So we can't decide, it's not right to decide, well, we'll just give him these drugs and keep quiet and leave out the emotional issue and not the disease. This is a horrible way to look at this disease. It's not the measles.
Let me just say a couple of words about that. Psychological harm to patients is not something that we dismiss, of course. it also has to be taken into account. What we said before was Lo tamod al dam re'echa, do not stand idly by on your brother's blood, applies to physical harm, psychological harm, and even financial harm. So if whatever the condition is, whether it's HIV, whether it's somebody who has other psychological problems that we might become aware of, we don't make a distinction about physical harm and psychological harm. If the criteria are met of us not passing on the information would cause the third party to be at high risk of serious harm, whether physically or emotionally or psychologically, then we have a responsibility to break that confidence. But only when those criteria are met. And we do not make a distinction between physical and psychological harm. That is a judgment call. Now, clearly, Nachum's judgment call about HIV and where he got it from, etc., would have to be taken into account on each and an individual case basis. And we would have to be very careful not to apply our own prejudices to a particular case. What we have to do is make a clinical judgment as to whether the harm or potential harm the risk is a serious risk, and whether the harm would be a serious harm. So we don't make a distinction between physical and psychological harm. Harm is harm. Okay, I'm tired. I shall wish you all a very good night. Please have a look at the handouts at your leisure. If you have any questions that you want to ask me, you can email me. You can reply to the email address that you get the links and the information sent out from by Avril. I have access to those emails. So if you have any questions you want to ask, any comments you want to make, anything you want to share with everybody else, then please use that email address. Please God, I will see you again next week, and I'll send you out the information as usual.
Thanks, Johnny.
Bye. Hi, Brian.
Tomorrow morning.
Hi, Brian.